Okay, Russ, great. We're live on
Hey, Bob.
Facebook. So, thank you all for attending here. This is the next episode of Life with Bob, and we have now a familiar face with us in Russ Concert, who
Hey,
was
Bob.
the director of the Shell Game Changer program, a petroleum engineer for 15 years. And, well, I guess you were still a petroleum engineer, but a petroleum engineer that ran all of the innovation for Shell. And as you told me, you said, we looked at things that you can imagine and we looked at things that you couldn't imagine. So at some point we'll have a conversation about that. But
I'd have to kill you, Bob.
oh, you have to kill me. Well, no, let's not do that.
Oh,
That wouldn't
sorry.
work. That'd bum my whole day out.
Not crazy.
Okay. So anyway, tonight we're talking about blue nest beef, and specifically we're talking initially about the carbon cycle in the soil, how intensive paddock grazing of beef is one of the most effective ways of returning carbon to the soil. And as you said, Russ, you were in the carbon business before, and you're still in the carbon business, but just for a different end of it. So great to have you here, and let's get rolling.
Yeah, I say I used to be in the dead carbon business, and I'm in the living carbon business. So the dead carbon business was about taking it out, and the living carbon business is about putting it back.
Well, and we're glad you're on this side now.
Yeah, honestly, it's really, really complicated, but it's nice to see the whole picture and not just half of it.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's the way to say it. So I think, Bob, what we talked about is maybe I just share a few slides and pictures to get the conversation started about how carbon goes in and how we measure some things, and kind of some insights that led us to the business direction we're going in now. And then we can take questions from you and other folks. So let's see here.
Sure.
If I can do this right, I'm going to do it.
And while you're doing that, I'm going to see if I can bring up my Facebook so that I can see what's happening and answer questions, see the questions as they come in. Okay, so, okay, we're on. I see us.
Okay, are you seeing my slide here now, Bob?
Seeing your slides, yeah, there's a slight delay, but good. All right, so let's talk about pulsed grazing.
Yeah, pulsed grazing. And if, you know, it's a descriptive word, not meant to be too technical in here, but I thought it might be helpful. This is a picture I crudely drew. You can tell I don't have artistic skills.
It's pretty good.
Cut and placed with some arrows and clip art to illustrate the big principles here. I think most people understand at least the surface side of photosynthesis in a plant, that you're taking carbon from the air and energy from the sun and water from the soil, and that all goes into this process that we might not quite remember from high school chemistry class. But what it does is make a sugar, and then that sugar gets routed in a bunch of directions. Part of it gets used to make plant material. The part that's hidden from us that we may not appreciate is that depending on the plant, the season, and a whole bunch of things we probably don't fully understand, the plant shares some of those sugars. It exudes those sugars out its roots. And if you ask yourself, why does it do that? It's not because nature evolved leaky plants because it was inefficient. It evolved leaky plants because it was good for the plant. So what's happening down in the soil that you don't see there are the two arrows on the left there, where the sugar is coming out of the leaky roots and back into the plant are coming minerals. Those are coming from the soil. Now, over here on the other side, with the parent soil material itself, we've got this complex interplay heavily with fungi, bacteria actually involved as well. They're secreting chemicals that dissolve minerals out of the parent soil material, and then they're churning around in this biological system that we call life, or might be a food pyramid in here, where you go from the tiny little microbes, bacteria, and fungi to slightly bigger species and so on, until you get to worms and snails and slugs and so on. And you get this food pyramid going on in this system. But what's really happening is this living system is catalyzing the process that's mining nutrients from soil and bringing it back to plants. And in the process of doing that, just that alone is accumulating carbon in the soil. Then what's important to understand is with this pulsed grazing, and I'll refer to in a few minutes as amp grazing, is that if you come in and you kind of eat the grass, but not too much, you just think of it as taking the top half of the grass off. You tell the grass, hey, I just lost my head, I want to regrow. So the grass turns on its photosynthetic engine more aggressively, let's say, and regrows again. And so you get this constant thing that I put that little pump jack up there to show that basically when the grazing is done in this pulse kind of manner, the grazing of the herbivore is pumping effectively carbon down into this cycle in the soil. And so that's kind of mechanistically what's going on. There are other aspects. Some of the vegetation dies. There's an important recycling of nutrients thing. The cow basically taking on board what it needs to drive its own metabolism and then sending a lot of things out the backside as manure, and they get to go around the trip again. So you get this very condensed cycling of nutrients, all of which from a biological perspective is helping nature cycle nutrients closely in order to maximize how much solar energy it can capture that's coming in. That's kind of really what's going on.
So Russ, before we go on to this slide, let's just fill people in on a little bit more of a background of what you're doing. What is pulse grazing? You know, what's the actual business that you're in? What does it look like?
Oh, so yeah, I'll maybe hop over a little bit here. So amp grazing is a way to graze cattle in a way that regenerates soil and regenerates the environment. Operationally, it produces more grass and more nutrient-rich grass, so we can produce more and better cattle. What we're doing now, and you'll see it here in a few minutes, is having looked at many ways we might be able to turn this into a viable business. We've started a company called Blue Nest Beef, where we're working with the National Audubon Society to now use beef that's been produced using these methods and shipping it direct to consumers' doorsteps nationwide. So I'll kind of get to that in a few minutes.
Sure. But you know, the actual where the cow ends up on the in the environment is you contract with ranches. You know, the ranchers have the cattle, and then they operate the land in a way that's certified by Audubon that
Correct.
Promotes this kind of, you know,
regeneration. It's pumping carbon and driving life, which I'll explain here in the next few pictures. So a bit of a unusual doorway into this thing. I want to kind of, you know, I look forward to getting to the business side, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a lot.
Sure, absolutely.
But in the carbon side of this thing, we actually do have technology now that allows us to measure carbon going in and out of the ground in real time. This is a pasture down by me in coastal Texas. That little device you see there is literally measuring micro puffs of air as they kind of wander up or wander down, and the concentrations of CO2, methane, and moisture in the air. And then also the radiation of solar energy coming in and bouncing back out. And from that, we can basically get a highly accurate mass and energy balance of what's happening at that pasture. It's kind of like a power meter for a pasture, if you will, or any ecosystem. These things work in rainforest as well. The technology is called eddy covariance. It's expensive, but it's accurate. I'll show you a picture here now. This is just a little snapshot of, I guess this is about a little over, almost a month. It's just a month in the spring. Last spring, I happened to grab a snapshot here. And what I've done here is the carbon curve is the black thing that you see here.
Yep.
And when you see the shading down below the line, that means carbon's going into the ground. It's going into the ecosystem. And when it's going up, that means it's being respired back out. So respiration, photosynthesis. And what I like about this picture is it's back in mid-April to mid-May. And you can kind of see how the carbon is getting deeper and deeper.
Oh, yeah.
That's the sun coming back to the northern hemisphere
Hmm.
In the springtime, where the grass is starting to grow more and starting to take up more carbon each and every day. What's going on here now is that the earth is starting to store carbon. And what's intriguing is this instrumentation allows us to actually count it with amazing accuracy. However, it's expensive and it's hard to do everywhere.
Right.
And the thing that I draw your attention to back in that first thing is that nature already has an ideal sensor, and that's birds. So if, for those that didn't notice at the top of that little food pyramid that I've just amplified here now, and I've used a metal arc as a symbol, is that when this system of carbon is functioning well, the birds will have food to eat and places to live, and so you'll get more birds. So that's not too abstract. Here's a couple of pictures from a ranch that's been managed that way. On the left, starting at time 1, was in pretty poor condition and using this kind of grazing after about 4 years. You can see how it's lush with vegetation again.
Wow.
This is a different ranch, but it's actually not too far away. It's just preliminary data on a research project we're doing down here with this is the number of observations of birds that are the dark green ones, so they have to live in grasslands. So they're species that only like to live in grass. The light green ones are birds that you might find in grasses. You might find them in trees and shrubbery and other things, in gray or non-grassland birds. And what hopefully you can see on the left here is this is a reference natural area, so like a prairie. This is a conventional pasture in the middle, and this amp grazing pasture on the right. And what you can see, it's a real night and day difference between this amp pasture and the conventional pasture. So the shift from this kind of dirty, beat up, flat, like mowed to the ground pasture to a lush vegetative pasture creates a lot of bird habitat. And just so you can understand it, I threw in a picture here of a meadowlark nest. The meadowlark is a bird that actually starts by building its nest in the hoof prints of grazing animals. It needs to be in a small depression. That depression could have come there from somewhere else, but in a healthy ecosystem where you might have had elk and bison moving through a system, you'd have hoof prints, and that forms the starting point for a bird's nest. And what you can see even in here is now we've obviously got some tall grass around it. But notice here at the top how the bird has actually used some of that tall grass and it's folded it over like a roof of the nest to create a nesting spot. So if you don't have kind of varying height vegetation, even if you have the food, the insects and the seeds, but if you don't have this varying height vegetation, you don't have habitat for birds. So this is where, and I realize this chart is really busy, but this is a recent paper that came out of Cornell by Rosenberg et al. Here in September. It went through and tried to document for all North American birds what the population was in 1970 versus 2017. The blue ones are the grassland birds. And across the board, depending on how you slice it, we've lost 2.5 to 3 billion birds in North America in the last 50 years. But the largest proportionate loss has been in grassland birds, where you see we've lost a little over half of the grassland birds in just the last 50 years. And I mean, it's not like in 1970 things were pristine. We were already destroying habitat pretty good back then, but we certainly got better at destroying habitat since that time. And so we're now at a state where 74% of the species, including the meadowlark, the eastern meadowlark, which was in the last picture I showed you, has actually lost 75% of its population in the last 50 years. So you don't have to be too good at remembering high school math to realize 75% every 50 years, pretty soon you won't have any birds left, right? They're just really disappearing rapidly. So as we talked about when we started there, we're now working with the National Audubon Society to implement a program where we can take, and maybe I should back up, National Audubon Society had separately come to the realization that these birds were in steep decline, say 4 or 5 years ago, and their biggest opportunity to bring back grassland birds was to work with the largest private landowners of grasslands, and that meant ranchers. And so they implemented conservation ranching protocols. Well, it just so happens that those conservation ranching protocols are pretty much the same as the protocols that we would use to graze and pump carbon in the ground. Again, you're building soil health, you're building structured habitat, and you get this thing ecosystem working again. So they've now got 1.8 million acres enrolled in this system to date. You can see the little dots all over the map here. They're dominated in what's called the Central Flyway, what you and I would call the Great Plains.
Yep.
Of course, the former grasslands of yesteryear. Now as Blue Nest Beef, we're working with them to bring that beef direct to people's doors nationwide. So consumers, whether you're in New York or Los Angeles, can order food that's not only healthier food, but is doing healthy things for the environment at the same time. So I guess maybe it's helpful to say a little bit more about the Audubon certification process.
That'd be great. And also a little bit more about what the intensive grazing is. As I understand it, it's like the buffalo would come to, I don't know what the cycle is, every 2 years or something like that. The vast herds would come and they'd eat the grass down, but only so much. And their hooves would pierce and their manure would be there, and then they would move on, but they wouldn't come back until the grass had regrown.
Yeah, that's the nub of it. And that's what's kind of the foundation of the Audubon program as well, which is you're trying to mimic what the grazing behavior of the roaming bison would be, which is dense herds, eating intensely, but moving frequently, not staying in one place very long. Right. And it's like eating the frosting off the cake and then moving to some more frosting.
Okay.
Right. And then not coming back. And of course, as they were migrating up and down the Central Plains here, you get these seasonal patterns effective as well. So really what we're doing is humans now is trying to manage that ecosystem in a way that as closely as possible, using primarily cattle. I mean, you can do it with sheep, you can do it with bison, any grazing herbivore, really to kind of get this system going again. You're trying to replicate that again. So Audubon protocols actually have 4 categories in them that maybe it's helpful to speak specifically to. The habitat management includes some of these grazing practices, but Audubon also comes in then and works with each and every rancher to understand, based on the lay of the land at their ranch, what are the birds that would like to be there? What can they do differently in order to create habitat for different kinds of birds? What are target bird species? So each ranch has its own habitat management plan. Forage and feeding just limits conditions. You can't have cattle in confinement. You can't be feeding cattle, just grain, and at least in heavy proportions for Audubon. There's animal health and welfare things. So there's no hormones, no antibiotics allowed in the program. And then there's some broader environmental sustainability things that restrict, like pesticide use. We come as Blue Nest and just layer on top of that 100% grass-fed standards. So we can comply with the expectation and what we think is a truly healthier product anyway, is 100% grass-fed. And then that's what we deliver the door. I mean, we're just getting started. I was looking at my notes from last time we talked, Bob, and I think it was just before we started shipping.
Right before the first box is shipped.
Yeah, exactly. And now we've shipped our first boxes, and we just had our 4th set of shipments that went to the FedEx depot this evening.
Very good.
So we're literally, we're real now. It's really, really excited. So the rancher you see there, Jeannie Francis, is in South Dakota. About 85% of the cattle that were in the first boxes came from her ranch in South Dakota.
Oh, wonderful.
And her partner, Dennis Hoyle, in another ranch run by Larry Wagner. So our strategy here is to be able to bring as much beef as possible from across this region, kind of maybe even synthetically mimicking that seasonal grazing bison. The next load of cattle that we'll be picking up will be coming this week from that little dot there in north central Oklahoma.
Right.
And that'll be going to the processors on Thursday. So we're literally just getting this thing going, and it's our embodiment for how to wrap a commercial business around a concept that could be better for people and better for the planet at the same time. And then give people an opportunity to directly participate in that food system. So really this won't work if consumers don't say, hey, I want to buy beef that's done good things for bird and habitat and carbon and all this other stuff.
And
it only
also
works.
tastes better and is healthier because it's because the nature of the animal being fed grass rather than
Yeah, for myself, I mean,
hormones.
before I really knew much about the grazing and the science, I kind of learned my way to the grass-fed beef world and kind of ruined my appetite for ordinary steaks a long time ago.
Yeah.
I can't eat out in nice restaurants anymore because I just don't enjoy the flavor as much. But yeah, it's a really enjoyable, flavorful experience. And I would articulate scientifically that's because it's a nourishing experiment. I think when we listen to our bodies, they tell us we've developed the technology that allows us to lie to our bodies.
Yes.
There's a gentleman by the name of Mark Schatzker wrote a great book called The Dorito Effect. I can't remember if we've talked about it before, Bob.
No, we haven't.
Basically, I think he makes a good argument that one of the places we really went off the rails is when we decoupled taste and flavor from nourishment.
Yes.
And so when you could sprinkle something on a processed corn chip and make it taste really good, you wanted to eat more of it, but you really weren't getting any nourishment. You were just getting a lot of flavor that was triggering things in your word sense. When you have grass-fed beef or any other real whole food that's been grown in healthy soil that's rich in nutrients,
Yep.
you have a taste and your body goes, wow.
I want that. I want that.
Yeah, I want that, right? And you don't understand it maybe so much scientifically, but you know that your body says, hey, that's good. So the good news is Jeannie did a great job with the first load. We're getting great feedback from folks on the first boxes that they really appreciated the flavor. And so we're proud to be associated with ranchers like Jeannie.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, if you talk to anyone who is dealing with nutrient-dense food, then they'll make that same point, that the food actually tastes better. And our taste, Dan Kittredge
Right.
from Bionutrient Food Association, makes the point that the secondary proteins that actually drive the plant to be able to withstand insects. If you make more of those secondary proteins, the plant becomes indigestible to insects.
Mm-hmm.
As he said, if insects are eating your crop, you're actually not raising people food, you're raising insect food.
Yeah, that's good. Dan's a smart guy. And I think that's right. I think the more and more we learn about nature, it has these complex signaling and correction mechanisms in it, right? So
yeah.
Indeed, pests attract weak plants. And if their pests are present, but the predators of the pests aren't present, then they get out of balance.
Right.
And so there's these complex webs of things. And the thing you mentioned, what we call, I like the way Fred Provenza, who's a retired grazing scientist from Utah State, says secondary and tertiary compounds, that there's this marvelous array of compounds that are present in trace amounts in food that our body recognizes and needs. And our animals, what he was able to do, he was a grazing researcher, and he was able to document how grazing herbivores could self-medicate, select foods when they were sick,
yep.
By selecting things that their bodies recognized as something that was missing and needed or could treat the condition that they had. And they didn't have PhD goats running around telling them,
well,
eat
who
this
knows?
plant, right?
Yeah.
Because it's got this in it.
Not that we know of, right?
Yeah. And so I'm just a firm believer now, as a reformed, retrained, I don't know, still relearning engineer, that nature's had a lot of this figured out for a long time. And, one of the things I like about that flux tower technology, it's kind of more in my wheelhouse as the engineer and scientist here, is it shifts us from our scientific perspective as trying to control nature, which is what genetic engineering would do, or cheat nature, create something that didn't exist in nature, to observing nature so we can understand her and work with her, right? That's what observational technologies, it's no less wondrous, it's no less scientific. I think it's more scientific, but it puts us in a humbler position as a human being to try to watch and grasp and understand and apply what's happening in the natural ecological system. And I think the better we get it as humans at doing that, the more successful we'll be as a species on the planet. So,
Well, yeah, if you just think about what if bird species decided that wanted to eat the equivalent of a Dorito,
right.
something that had really almost no food value whatsoever, but tasted really good.
Maybe you saw this too. Somebody had a little Facebook post here the other day of a beekeeper who was having trouble keeping the bears at bay. And he decided to turn lemons into lemonade. He basically turned the bears into taste testers of honey. He would take different honey from different places and put it out there, and then he'd have game cameras out there, and he would watch which honey pots the bears would go after, and he'd say, "That's the good stuff."
That's the good stuff.
And I think it's the same thing. I tell
Great.
people that the advantage that birds have ecologically is they vote with their wings, right?
Mhm.
Birds are the most mobile species we have on the planet. And so if there's something good ecologically going on over here that's not going on over here, you're going to find the birds over there. And so I think there really is something to resurrecting that old concept of the canary in the coal mine. Some people say that the meadowlark is the canary of the prairie. And
Right.
I think that's right. That you've got these kind of birds that we can observe, watch, and understand. And, maybe it's, 20 years, maybe it's 50 years, maybe it's 100, I don't know, before we have some vast, elegant sensor network out there that can, quantify what's going on in all ecosystems all the time with, just wonderful accuracy. But I don't think we need to wait, right? I think we can watch the birds and we'll know what's going on. And Bob, I know
Right, probably have more fun, and the sensors won't do a thing for the environment. The birds will, right?
the birds are functional as well, right? I mean, we know also that the birds are really important cyclers of nutrients. They transport nutrients across continents.
Yeah.
And they are transporting seeds. So indeed, they're not, you can't replace them. I think the most egregious example of just idiot technology, I can't say it any more clearly, is the robotic bumblebee, right? Which got all the rave on the internet maybe 5 years ago or so. Really clever. And I'm sure as an engineer, I would have had a blast working on a project like that.
What a bumblebee.
But I'm just like, dude, what the hell are you thinking? Bees will work for free if you don't kill them, right?
I think so.
And
like make bees that cost $5,500 a bee, right?
Exactly. Even if I could make them for $500 a bee or $50 a bee, they still cost, right? I still had to mine up some lithium somewhere, and I had to mine something somewhere, and I had to process it with heat. I had to do something with it. Nature's this wonderful self-replicating adaptive technology that's highly diverse. And again, I think we as humans, if we can learn to let nature be the judge, right? Because, even in this space, I think that there's a lot of well-intended people. We probably have mutual friends that have done things like write rules for organic agriculture.
Right.
And things like that. But over time, human beings being human beings, we try to figure out ways to cheat the rules and stuff like that. Well, you can't
game them and get around it.
You game them and get around them, but you can't do that with a bird. You can't do that with wildlife. You could try to put something out there that looks and smells like something, but if it's not something, they're going to go to the something and
they're going to leave your thing. Well, the funny thing, not to get overly philosophical about it, but it always amuses me a little bit when people use their mind, which manifestly they did not make,
right,
and their eyes and their senses and all of the mechanism. Where the heck did we think we came from?
Yeah.
We talk about nature as if it was different
separate from
us.
Right. Yeah. What I think this does,
but we have to take the ancients of virtually every culture recognize that we have a particular kind of mistake of the senses where we can, because when we open up our eyes we see outside, right? We don't see inside,
right?
And many people never give a thought as to where the thoughts come from.
Yeah, I really think
comes from.
All indigenous peoples had a healthy regard for themselves as a part of a natural ecological system. And I think now we know enough to realize that that's scientifically true. Maybe our Western, the road we took, necessarily went down that road. But now that we followed that road, it's brought us back to the same realization our ancestors knew a long time ago, which is we're a part of nature. Now, I think now you're getting a little personal philosophy here. I think we learned a lot along that road. By breaking nature down into pieces, we developed an amazing understanding of some detailed mechanisms for how it works. And the challenge we have in front of us now is how to put those pieces back together, right? How to make them work as a systems. And it's one of the things. I think that relationship between a cow and grass and soil, a bird, sunshine, water, microbes, it's complicated, but it's not that complicated. It's understandable, and it exists over a large enough area that the principles can apply. I know you've got some great grazers there in and around Fairfield.
Right.
And so I think we're going to learn a lot by making that system work. But I think in the process of making that work, we're going to learn about how we relate to the natural ecosystem and how to make it work in other parts of our economy too. Because I think, it's an area I feel comfortable speaking critically of because I'm an engineer, but us engineers are probably the poster children for what's wrong with Western civilization. We learn to think in lines instead of loops. Our ecological friends think in loops. Engineers like me were trained to think of inputs, processes, and outputs, and all the other stuff was somebody else's problem. In nature, all the other stuff is interconnected, and it's really, really important. And so, this is like 3D, 4D engineering, if you will, now, right? We're working with complex interdependent systems with lots of feedback loops. They're really complicated if we were to try to draw them out in equations on a piece of paper. But phenomenologically, by observing them, we can understand them. And I think at their core, everything still follows the same scientific principles. So all the things we've learned apply. We just have to learn to apply them differently.
Well, yeah, I think that's our reductionist mentality, which comes from, I believe anyway, the mistake of the senses. The mistake that we can easily make separating ourselves from ourselves, and therefore from our roots, if you will, from nature. So we, that mistake of perception then kind of clips us off, and here we are having thoughts and trying to be happy and going here and going there, and all the time searching for the thing that that will make us happy or satisfied, which in reality is our own consciousness, our own inner world. And so this being able to understand how nature works and then reflect that back on ourselves, I think is critically important.
No, it makes a lot of sense to me, Bob. And I certainly see it even observationally. Again, I'm a scientist at my core, is that people that have adapted these regenerative agricultural practices, they rediscover a relationship with land, life, and ecosystems. I guess they, in very many cases, knew was missing, but maybe didn't fully appreciate. So there's a sense of wonder, awe, respect that comes back to the farm, if you will, in people that are involved in regenerative agriculture that's very spiritual.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of definitions of spirituality, but
yeah, exactly. And I think everybody
one the touchstone that I have is, are we aware of our own awareness? Are we aware of the silent bed that sits beneath all of the activity? And somehow, by virtue of connecting to natural cycles through a mechanism that I don't pretend to understand, I think we end up back into our own kind of native self, if you will, and feel that sense of quiescence and sense of peace and sense of orderliness that is very hard to find out in the forms and phenomena. You can get totally lost in there. So
Right.
we need something to root us back. And it's interesting that for a long time, I don't, what's it called? I can't remember the term, but there's a medical term in Japan called forest walking. And
Okay.
it's a prescription. And you go out and
Oh,
walk in the forest, and it actually creates a physiological effect. Well, Scotland picked it up, and you can get a prescription
for
in
forest
Scotland.
walking.
You can get a prescription in Scotland for going out and walking in nature. I know that because my niece goes to school at St. Andrews. And so it seems a little funny, but
Yeah, I think our challenge now is, we've become so decoupled, with the meta trend on the planet of urbanization, right, is increasingly decoupled people from natural ecosystems.
right.
And I don't know that there's any substitute for a forest walk or truly getting out in a prairie.
Yeah.
And I think that still ought to remain the goal. But I think it's really important in the meantime that people just at least get a conceptual understanding that they're part of an ecological system that's bigger than themselves. And so it's certainly forefront in my own thinking about how can we engage people with the simple realization that everybody eats,
Mhm.
participating when they make choices with food to be a part of a system that's making the planet healthier instead of sicker. The other part, my Audubon friends have a saying that the birds are both the measure and both the treasure and the measure.
Hmm.
So the treasure means they're a legitimate conservation goal, but the measure, all this other stuff, that's what I was talking about before in
Right,
terms of a
right, right.
carbon sensor or whatever. But if we can, and I'm not sure how to articulate it because the thoughts just kind of forming in my head here, but if we as human beings have a propensity to want to blame things, thus the term like scapegoats, right?
Mhm.
But whatever the opposite of scape is, I want to make that of a bird, right? Which is like we to use the symbolism and the reality of birds as a mechanism by which people can reconnect with the natural world in a way that's accessible to them. Because everybody will still they won't see a meadowlark in the city
Right.
in most places, but they'll see other birds in the city, and that'll help them understand that grassland birds are important and their food was produced in a way that was doing something good. And by the way, if there are more birds, that's a sign there's a lot of other good stuff going on.
Yep.
It'll be quite a challenge in an educational process as a business to make this work and make it scale scientifically. And objectively, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Well, you were very smart. I don't know how many people are touched directly or indirectly by Audubon, but it's many millions, isn't it?
Yeah, 1.65 million members that they touch directly, and a total reach of roughly 5 million folks in the United States alone.
Right. And so it was a very intelligent business strategy that actually
Yeah, it's a mutually beneficial.
initially, right.
Yeah, Audubon needs more acres producing beef in a way that does good things for birds. They already have millions of people that they communicate with routinely. And we have a team of people that are experienced grass-fed beef pioneers that know how to select, process, ship grass-fed beef. So it's really kind of a match made in heaven here. So, like I said, we're just getting started. But from my own perspective, bringing that science and scale of a business at scale, it's a matter of how do what we're trying to do here with Blue Nest is put together a business that can grow very rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
And bring better beef with a bigger purpose direct to people's kitchens nationwide, and to get people reconnected to their food system. And I mean, what could be certainly beef itself has become quite the lightning rod or the scapegoat of our modern times here now. And I think I probably said it before. Years ago, I coined the phrase, "It's not the cow, it's the how." We've unwittingly and unintentionally transferred onto the cow itself the mistakes that we've made in our how, right? So we look at how we're producing cows, and whether you look at from an animal welfare perspective or an ecological perspective, and possibly a health perspective, you go, that's not good, right? But then we as human beings have transferred those feelings and perceptions as if the cow was the problem, when the problem was really ourselves, right? The problem was how we're producing the cattle, how we're managing cattle, how they're interacting with the land. Um, I, I like to say that life is a verb, not a noun. We tend to think of things in terms of objects, physical things we can touch.
Right.
Once you start learning to think in loops instead of lines, you realize that life is really all the processes that go on interactively between things. That's what life is. I mean, you and I would still be here as a noun if we stopped breathing in this instant, right?
Right.
But the life, the dynamic, the process would be out of us.
We would no longer be a verb, but we would
just no longer be a verb.
And very shortly, a fairly smelly one, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, in many ways, we've forgotten a lot of things our ancestors knew,
right.
Probably because of this process. You called it separation. What did you say?
Yeah, I mean, just a way of thinking about it is that we can't really be separate from ourselves. I mean, right. If we did, then, what you just talked about would happen. Yeah. We would cease to function. But because of the structure of our senses, I mean, at least classically, this is the way it's explained, that the senses point outwards. They don't point inwards. So because when we wake up in the morning,
we see
hardly anyone says, wow, I'm here again. And right. Wow, where did these thoughts come from? And wow, I got emotions. And wow, I can feel my big toe. We didn't even think about that, right? We just, the senses move out into the objects and we do our thing.
Right.
And we then become, in essence, kind of divorced from our source. And anything that can, again, this is just my interpretation, maybe wrong, maybe right, maybe half wrong, half right, whatever. But my interpretation is that anything that can provide an analogy for us, or anything that actually creates, just like, your brain, your taste buds know the secondary and tertiary proteins that we need.
Right.
We don't cognitively know it, but our body does.
Right. That's right.
And so, wow, this carrot tastes good. Why? Well, I can't tell you why. And then when you do a Brix value and everything else,
right. Then you can
loaded,
exactly
loaded with stuff. So, we don't have to understand the mechanism, but just my observation, and well, I posted an article a little while ago saying that, there's been, quite a bit of work done that show that people who garden regularly actually are happier, more optimistic, they live longer, they have fewer diseases. Well, why is that? Why would that be the case? Well, one could theorize that there's something about participating in the laws of nature as they're expressed in
the process of life, right?
Yeah, process in life. It takes us, it reduces that mistake of the senses a little bit. And it loops us back into natural flows. And so, that's.
Yeah, several years ago, I came and spoke with my mom's book club in Omaha. And when I was early on in this kind of soil carbon journey, and I said, someone asked me, well, what can we do? And I said, just teach your grandchildren to garden. I think we have to start by learning how nature works. Now I can tell them, tell your children to buy Blue Nest beef as well. Because now you can reach out through the commercial system and participate in something that does something bigger as well. But I agree with you that I think that all these, when we separate ourselves because of our senses from nature, things break. We're not really sure why. We don't understand how, but we know they're broken. And right now, a lot of stuff is broken. So, and what I certainly see, and I find great hope, is in these regenerative farmers. And like you said, this is, I'm focused on grasslands and beef right now, but whether it's regenerative vegetable farms or permaculture, had a wonderful conversation last week with a new friend in Brazil. Every environment on the earth works on the same principles. It works in these loops instead of lines. And once we understand how to reconnect to those loops of life in our local place, then wonderful things start happening again. So I feel like we're getting really philosophical, Bob. You and I we do talk,
we can wait.
and we can go on forever. But what
Yeah.
questions do you have, or maybe some of your friends have that we ought to talk about?
Well, I've been looking and I don't see any questions coming up, and I think that we're at 45 minutes. And I think I'm feeling a kind of a completeness with this. Another couple, 3 or 4 months, we'll get together, and there's innumerable rabbit holes.
Yeah, there's some really big ones.
It's so encouraging. Just maybe one final thought on, commercial business does reflect that separation of man from nature, man or women from their own source. And because of that, we can have so much of our commercial life, which is either completely banal, doesn't really do anything for anyone. It might generate money, but what's that? And so the idea, it just tickles me no end to have someone who was involved at the highest level at one of the most vast organizations with, a tremendous reach and a tremendous influence. And as you said, fossil fuels have given us the civilization we've had, but now we need to fairly quickly cycle out of that because the negative ramifications of that linear take, make, waste, we just can't live with anymore. And so the idea of coming up with business systems that create a profit, business, as one business guy who, amazing fellow from Chicago, he wrote a book, says, why go into business to make a profit when there's so many better reasons for doing it?
Well, it's true. Yeah. And once again, I think one of the things we broke in the Western world, and I think we broke it badly in the last 50 years, is that we adapted this belief that profit was somehow antithetical to purpose, right? And that you had to sacrifice one for the other. As you know, Bob, we're chartered as what's called a B Corp under Delaware law. That means we have explicitly enumerated public benefits in our corporate charter that we're not only allowed to, but we're obligated to consider when we're making corporate decisions. That's an example of a type of law that helps make explicit, which is something I think has always been there and available to good businesses, but some have forgotten. But one of the things we're trying to prove with Blue Nest is that profit and purpose are not antithetical at all. In fact, it's back to that synergy thing again, just like the synergy between a cow and grass or bee and a flower, is that once you understand the rightful relationship between these things, then one thing feeds the other, not the other way around. This is why I think by starting with the ones we can see in agriculture right now, we're going to relearn some important things about how our economy works, how business should work, how jobs and livelihoods should work. And we're going to do that by watching cows eat grass, which it sounds silly, but I think we've talked about it before. Not only can you eat your cake and have it too, but you can if you eat your cake right, you get more cake to eat too. So there's that's how profit and purpose go together, right? They feed each other in time if they're a part of the right system where, we've invented these words, they're black and white or words. You're either my friend or foe. I'm either the predator or the prey. Nature isn't quite that simple. And a lot of people, now appreciate that. And I don't blame Darwin at all, but our simplification of Darwin, of a survival.
It wasn't Darwin's deal.
Right.
It was the British nobility at the time grabbing onto that and.
Right. They latch it.
Yeah.
They run it through their filters of Western mindsets, and they come up with, you have to compete, and whoever competes the best wins, and the other person dies, and they go away. Of course, it suits our Western mindsets, right?
That means that we can go and be rapacious.
Exactly. It was like a justification for pillaging the earth. And I think a deeper, more thoughtful, and honestly much more scientific view of the earth is an appreciation that even the language fails us, that competition and collaboration is probably a better word, but it's probably still incomplete. One of my friends likes to say nature is ruthlessly collaborative. And I think that's a nice way to describe it. It really is constantly working, churning. Now, I would argue scientifically that in total, what nature is really trying to do is figure out how to capture more sunshine. Again, the cow grass thing is just an example of that. But that's what all those circles of life are doing. And whether you're a species or an ecosystem, they're all trying to do that in the end. And so in a lot of ways, I think we're going to learn from this how to, I mean, we've taken a stab at this in our business model. We've taken a stab at this in our corporate charter and articulating our public benefits. But we're going to learn a lot. So we're kind of entering this with some really deep humility, some good hypothesis, and ability to experiment and test. We're pretty darn committed, though. And you know, maybe we're just arrogant in a different way. I don't know, that we think that we're arrogant enough to think that we can prove that we don't have to sacrifice profits and purpose, and we can manage them in a way that, just like a cow eating grass can grow more grass, if we can run a business that creates happy customers, that create more customers, that create healthier food, create more profits, and all those things feed together. So you know, that's a hypothesis that we're setting off with. And like I said, we're just getting started. 4 shipments went out today. So
well, Russ, I salute you for that, you and your entire team. So Facebook friends, we're going to jump off, but thank you very much for being with us. Russ, this was absolutely fabulous.
Always love talking with you, Bob. Thanks. Have a good evening.